Commander Vralis' massive form barely fit in the metal chair designed for smaller species. His chitinous armor scraped against the walls of the cramped interrogation room deep within the Corvani High Command bunker. The fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across his battle-scarred carapace, highlighting dozens of plasma burns and projectile wounds that still hadn't fully healed. 8 months. 8 months since the 3rd Assault Legion had limped back from the Kepler sector with barely half their original numbers. 8 months of nightmares, of waking up in cold sweats remembering the screams of his soldiers and the terrible silence that followed human ambushes. 8 months of refusing to speak about what had happened out there in the darkness between stars. Military investigator Thexura sat across from him, her sleek blue skin unmarked by combat scars. She had never seen real war, never watched good. Soldiers die because they underestimated an enemy. Her pristine uniform and polished insignia marked her as one of the desk warriors who sent others to fight battles they couldn't imagine. "This conversation is being recorded for military archives," she announced, her voice crisp and professional. "State your full designation and last assignment for the record." Ralith's 6 compound eyes tracked the small recording device as its red light blinked to life. Such a tiny thing to capture such enormous failure. He shifted his weight, feeling the phantom pain from wounds that would have killed him if not for the strange mercy humans sometimes showed their enemies. "Commander." Verlith, serial designation 77 Alpha 9, 3rd Assault Legion, Kepler Sector Campaign. Each word felt like swallowing broken glass. "You really want to know about the humans, investigator? About why the most advanced military force in the galaxy turned tail and ran from a species that still uses chemical propulsion for their spacecraft?" Exara. Membrane-thin ears twitched with interest. The official reports had been sanitized, stripped of detail, classified beyond her security level. All she knew was that somehow, impossibly, the humans had fought the mighty Corvani Empire to a standstill. "The preliminary reports suggest tactical miscalculations," she said carefully. "Perhaps underestimating their defensive capabilities. Vrola's mandibles clicked together in what might have been laughter if it didn't. "Sounds so broken, investigator. When we arrived in their system, the humans had exactly 47 military vessels. Patrol boats, mostly. Old converted cargo haulers with guns bolted to their hulls. We brought 300 ships of the line, each one capable of glassing a continent." He paused, remembering the confident briefings before the invasion. "The intelligence reports that classified humans as a Class C threat. Barely worth the fuel costs for a proper military response. They were supposed to be another easy conquest, another primitive species to be absorbed into the Empire's growing territories. The humans have names," he continued, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "That was the first thing that surprised us. All our previous campaigns, enemy soldiers were just targets, numbers on casualty reports. But the humans, they made sure we knew their names." Dexara leaned forward, her stylus poised over her datapad. This wasn't in any of the reports she'd seen. Park Woo-jin was a sniper stationed on Ridge 77 during the first planetary assault. One human, investigator. One soldier with an ancient projectile rifle that should have bounced harmlessly off our combat armor. He held that ridge for 6 hours against an entire company of our best troops. Verlis' carapace began to darken, a physiological response to stress that he couldn't control. The memories were flooding back now, unstoppable as a dam burst. We lost 43 soldiers to that one human before we finally called in an orbital strike. 43 of the Empire's finest warriors, killed by metal slugs fired from a weapon our ancestors might have used. When the bombardment was over and we secured the position, we found his dog tags. That's how we learned his name, the investigators. Stylus scratched across the datapad. "Surely one skilled marksman doesn't account for Lisora," Vrolith interrupted. "Combat medic with the human colonial defense force. She turned medical supplies into explosives that could penetrate our vehicle armor. Bandages soaked in cleaning chemicals became incendiary devices. Surgical tools became precision weapons. She saved human lives while taking ours, sometimes in the same moment." While his voice was getting stronger now, the words coming faster as if he'd been holding them back for too long. "Kim Minjin, an engineer who turned their waste processing systems into chemical weapon delivery platforms. Choi Hijin, a communications specialist who somehow hacked our tactical networks using nothing but scavenged electronics and raw determination. Dexura's ears had gone flat against her skull, a sign of growing unease. These sound like isolated incidents of competence, not isolated? Vralith's laugh was harsh and bitter. Every human we encountered had a name, Investigator. Every single one of them fought like they were personally responsible for their entire species' survival. They didn't just follow orders, they improvised, adapted, overcame obstacles that should have been impossible. He stood abruptly, his massive frame casting shadows across the small room. We thought we understood warfare because we'd conquered 24 species. We had protocols, tactics, strategies refined over centuries of galactic dominance. Weapons that could melt through any known armor. Shields that could deflect planetary bombardments. Ships that could cross the void faster than light itself. His 6 eyes fixed on the investigator, and she suddenly understood why her predecessors had avoided this interview for months. There was something broken in those compound lenses, something that spoke of horrors, witnessed and truths learned too late. But the humans didn't follow our protocols, Investigator. They didn't fight the way conquered species were supposed to fight. They turned our own advantages against us, found weaknesses in systems we thought were perfect, and they did it all. While learning our tactics in real time, Vralith's carapace was now deep black, almost absorbing the harsh, fluorescent light. We thought we understood warfare. We were wrong. The forest moon of Kepler 7 looked peaceful from orbit. Rolling green hills covered in ancient trees, crystal-clear rivers winding through valleys, and small human settlements scattered like toys across the landscape. Vralith remembered standing on the bridge of the assault carrier Dominion's Edge, watching the planet grow larger on the main screen. His tactical officer had called it a vacation deployment, a chance for the Third Assault Legion to stretch their legs after months in hyperspace. 800 of the Empire's finest warriors against 200 colonial militia. The numbers were so lopsided that Vralith had initially protested the assignment. It felt like using a plasma cannon to kill insects. But High Command wanted the Kepler system secured quickly, and the Third Legion had a reputation for swift, decisive victories. The humans had been on that moon for maybe 50 years. Vralith continued, his voice taking on the cadence of someone reliving a nightmare. Loggers, miners, farmers, simple people trying to build new lives far from their crowded homeworld. Our intelligence said they had maybe 30 actual soldiers. The rest were just civilians with hunting rifles. Dexura made notes on her datapad, occasionally glancing up at the massive alien warrior. What was your initial strategy? Textbook planetary assault, Vralith replied. Orbital bombardment of strategic targets, followed by 3-pronged ground assault. Alpha Company would take the main settlement, Beta would secure the mining facilities, and Gamma would handle the communications array. Simple, clean, over in 6 hours. Paused, his mandibles clicking softly. The attack began at dawn, Kepler time. Our dropships came in low and fast, sensors sweeping for defensive positions. The human settlement looked almost deserted, just a few scattered heat signatures moving between buildings. Too easy, we thought. Way too easy. The first sign of trouble came when Alpha Company's lead dropship touched down in what should have been a secure landing zone. The pilot had run full scans, detected no threats, no weapon signatures, no signs of resistance, just open ground, surrounded by tall pine trees that reminded Vralith of his homeworld's sacred groves. The explosion came from nowhere, he said, his carapace darkening with the memory. One moment our troops were disembarking. The next moment, 30 of my best soldiers were just ... gone, vaporized. The dropship's armored hull was twisted into scrap metal, burning fuel spreading through the trees like liquid fire. Dexura. Stylus stopped moving. How? Your reports said the humans had no heavy weapons. They didn't, Vralith confirmed. But somehow, Sergeant Kim Du-Hyen had gotten his hands on our own plasma charges that should have been impossible for a human to acquire, let alone modify. He'd buried them in the landing zone, rigged with motion sensors salvaged from mining equipment. When our dropship's engines fired for landing, The heat signature triggered the detonation. The tactical display in Vralis's mind was still crystal clear. Red dots representing his soldiers winking out of existence one by one. Blue dots, the humans, moving through the forest like ghosts, striking without warning and disappearing. Before his forces could respond, Duhayan became a legend among our troops, he continued. Not because we respected him, but because we feared him. He moved through those trees like they were his personal domain, setting traps, picking off isolated soldiers, always staying one step ahead of our search patterns. The sergeant had somehow turned the forest itself into a weapon. Deadfall traps. That could crush a Corvani warrior in full armor. Pit traps lined with sharpened stakes. Snares that would trigger small explosives when stepped on. All of it made from materials that shouldn't have been dangerous to advanced alien soldiers. We had thermal imaging, motion sensors, atmospheric analysis equipment that could track a target from orbit, Vralith said. Duhayan had mud, leaves, and the patience of a hunter. He'd covered himself in local clay to mask his heat signature, moved only when the wind would cover his scent, and struck when our patrols were most vulnerable. The human sergeant's most audacious attack came on the second day. A full squad of Corvani soldiers had been pursuing him through a narrow canyon, confident that they finally had him trapped. The canyon walls were too steep to climb. The far end was blocked by fallen boulders, and their sensors showed only one heat signature ahead. Duhayan had somehow climbed the canyon wall using nothing but his hands and feet, Varalith recalled. It's possible for most species, but humans have this strange ability to push their bodies beyond normal limits. He waited until my soldiers were directly below him, then started an avalanche using explosives he'd made from fertilizer and fuel oil. 8 more soldiers lost to a primitive human using Stone Age tactics enhanced with desperate creativity. When the dust settled, Duhayan was gone again, vanished into the forest like a ghost made of flesh and determination. But Duhayan wasn't working alone. The human colonial defense force had turned the entire moon into a trap. Private Choi Minho, barely old enough to shave, had somehow penetrated the Corvani communication network using equipment that belonged in a museum. He'd intercepted their tactical frequencies and began broadcasting false coordinates to their orbital support. We called in artillery strikes on human positions, Vralith explained. Precision plasma bombardments that should have ended the resistance. In minutes, instead our own fire started falling on our own troops. Choi had somehow convinced our targeting computers that our soldiers were the enemy. The horror of watching friendly fire tear through his own forces was something Vralith would never forget. Soldiers he'd trained, fought beside, considered, brothers dying under fire from their own ships. The confusion, the panic. The growing realization that these primitive humans were running circles around the Empire's most advanced military technology. Lieutenant Yoon Hejin commanded their explosives team, he continued. She took mining charges designed for blasting through rock and turned them into anti-vehicle weapons, shaped charges that could punch through our armor, proximity mines. That would detonate when our hover tanks passed overhead, improvised rockets that somehow found weak points in our shielding. The humans adapted faster than the Corvani could compensate. Every new tactic the Empire tried, the humans countered within hours. When the Corvani switched to night operations, the humans began using their own thermal signatures against them, creating heat decoys that would draw fire while the real targets slipped away. When the Corvani tried aerial reconnaissance, humans shot down their drones with weapons jury-rigged from farming equipment. It was like fighting an enemy that evolved during combat, Vralith admitted. Every engagement made them smarter, more dangerous, more impossible to predict.
Ow.
We had centuries of military doctrine, tested strategies, proven tactics. They had raw desperation and the terrifying ability to turn anything into a weapon. The forest moon that had looked so peaceful from orbit became a green hell where every tree might hide a sniper. Every path might be trapped, and every quiet. A moment might be the calm before another devastating ambush. The humans weren't just defending their territory, they were teaching the galaxy's its most advanced military force that sometimes the most dangerous enemy is the one with nothing left to lose. Firebase Echo sat on a hilltop like a metal tumor growing. From the Earth, from Vralith's command position 3 kilometers away, it looked pathetically small through his tactical scope. just a collection of prefabricated buildings, storage tanks, and communication towers surrounded by basic concrete barriers. The kind of outpost that would fall to a single orbital strike under normal scarce circumstances. But these weren't normal circumstances anymore. The humans had turned Firebase Echo into the nerve center of their entire resistance operation. Every supply, convoy, every troop movement, every piece of intelligence flowed through that modest collection of structures. Take Firebase Echo, and the human resistance would collapse like a house of cards. 2,000 of my best soldiers, Vrald whispered to Thexera, his compound eyes reflecting the harsh interrogation room lights. Elite warriors with powered armor, energy weapons, and enough firepower to level a city against 150 humans with chemical projectile weapons and improvised defenses. Thexera shifted in her chair, uncomfortable with the growing intensity in the commander's voice. The tactical advantage was clearly in your favor. That's what we thought, Vraloth replied. Captain Anji-ho commanded their defense. 34 years old, former mining engineer turned soldier when the war started. Intelligence reports said he had no formal military training, just 6 months of basic combat instruction. We expected him to surrender when he saw our forces surrounding his position. Instead, Captain An had done something that violated every rule of conventional warfare. When the Corvani forces moved into siege positions, the human commander had opened a communication channel and delivered a message that still haunted Vralos's dreams. This is Captain Anji-ho of the Colonial Defense Force. You have 30 seconds to withdraw your forces before we make this hill too expensive for you to take. This is your only warning. Vraloth had laughed at the time, human with primitive weapons threatening the Empire's finest warriors. The audacity was almost amusing. Almost. The assault began at 0600 hours, Vraloth continued. Standard siege. TACTICS surround the position, cut off supply lines, then gradually tighten the noose until the enemy surrenders or dies. We had artillery support, air superiority, and enough troops to storm the position 10 times over. The first wave of attackers reached the outer perimeter within minutes. That's when the humans revealed their first surprise. The concrete barriers around Firebase Echo weren't just defensive positions, they were disguised weapons platforms. Hidden inside the seemingly solid walls were launching mechanisms that could fire everything from improvised rockets to containers of flammable chemicals. Corporal Lim Degen had turned their defensive wall into a giant shotgun, Vraloth explained. She'd packed the hollow sections with scrap metal, ball bearings, and anything else that could punch through armor. When our first assault team reached the perimeter, she triggered simultaneous explosions that turned the entire outer wall into a fragmentation weapon. 47 Corvani soldiers died in that first blast. Not from advanced human technology, but from nuts, bolts, and broken pieces of machinery fired at supersonic speeds. It was like being killed by a hardware store explosion, but that was just the beginning. As Vrolth's forces regrouped and prepared for a more cautious approach, the humans began demonstrating their talent for turning everyday equipment into instruments of war. The base's water purification system, designed to provide clean drinking water for the garrison, became a steam cannon that could cook a Corvani warrior alive inside his armor. Lim the Hid had modified the purification pumps to create superheated steam under extreme pressure, Vraloth said. When our soldiers tried to breach the main gate, she opened the valves and turned our own assault into a death trap. The steam was hot enough to melt flesh, pressurized enough to knock a warrior off his feet. Private First Class Han Minjun had spent the first day of the siege crawling through ventilation shafts like a ghost. The 19-year-old human was small enough to fit through spaces that would have trapped a Corvani soldier, and he used that advantage to wage a one-man sabotage campaign from inside the base's infrastructure. He somehow accessed our command frequencies, Vraloth recalled. Using nothing but scavenged electronics and raw determination, he began feeding false information into our tactical network. Our artillery started targeting empty ground while the real human positions remained untouched. But Han's most devastating attack came when he discovered the location of the Corvani Mobile Command Center. Using improvised explosives created from cleaning supplies and fertilizer, he managed to destroy 3 armored vehicles and kill 12 officers, including Vralith's second in command. A boy who should have been in school was out fighting trained military specialists, Vralith said. Turned household chemicals into military-grade explosives. Used ventilation systems like personal highways and struck at targets that should have been impossible to reach. As the siege dragged into its second day, the humans began showing signs of desperation that somehow made them more dangerous rather than less. When their ammunition supplies ran low, they didn't surrender. Instead, they began manufacturing new weapons from whatever materials they could find. Crossbows made from scrap metal and vehicle springs. Spears crafted from broken antenna arrays and kitchen knives. Slings that could launch rocks with bone-crushing accuracy. They turned their maintenance shop into a weapons factory, Vralith explained. Every piece of broken equipment became raw material for something that could kill us. Circuit boards became fragmentation grenades. Broken vehicle parts became armor-piercing projectiles. Medik Park Se-young represented everything that made the humans so terrifying to fight. When the base's medical supplies ran out on the second day, she didn't let wounded soldiers die. Instead, she began using cleaning chemicals as antiseptics, torn uniforms as bandages, and even used duct tape to hold broken bones in place long enough for soldiers to return to the fight. She saved lives with materials we would have thrown in the garbage, Vrolov said. A broken radiator became a surgical table. Industrial solvents became painkillers. She performed emergency surgery using tools scavenged from the motor pool. But Park's most disturbing innovation was her ability to turn medical procedures into weapons. When Corvani soldiers were wounded and captured, she would treat their injuries just enough to keep them alive, then use them as sources of intelligence. About Empire tactics and equipment, not through torture, but through simple medical care that made the prisoners want to cooperate. She was healing our soldiers and turning them against us at the same time, Vralith admitted. Some of our wounded started providing tactical information to the humans, not because they were traitors, but because she had shown them kindness when their own army couldn't evacuate them. The siege should have ended in hours. Humans were outnumbered, outgunned, and cut off from any hope of reinforcement. Instead, it became a grinding nightmare where every meter of ground cost dozens of Corvani lives. The humans didn't just defend their position, they made the Empire pay such a terrible price for every small victory that the victories felt like defeats. They turned their desperation into a weapon, Vrolith said, his voice barely audible. We had advanced technology, superior numbers, and centuries of military experience. They had the terrifying ability to make something deadly out of anything they could find. We had never encountered anything like it. The 72-hour siege of Firebase Echo became the turning point of the entire campaign. Humans won, but because they proved that winning and losing were human concepts that didn't apply to the way they fought wars. They fought to make their enemies remember them, and in that goal, they succeeded beyond their wildest dreams. The dawn of the third day brought no relief to Vralith's battered forces. Firebase Echo still stood defiantly on its hilltop, smoke rising from dozens of small fires where improvised human weapons had found their marks. Through his tactical scope, Vralith could see the humans moving between their defensive positions. Like ghosts, somehow still fighting, despite having no supplies, no reinforcements, and no hope of survival. His own troops were a different story. Elite Corvani warriors who had conquered entire star systems now flinched at shadows. Had never known fear were jumping at every sound, expecting human traps and ambushes around every corner. The psychological warfare was more devastating than any plasma weapon the Empire had ever faced. By the third morning, we had lost over 600 soldiers, Vralith told Dexera, his mandibles clicking nervously. The humans had maybe 30. Defenders left. Basic mathematics said we should have overwhelmed them through sheer numbers. But mathematics don't account for the human spirit. Sergeant Major Otejo was 42 years old. A career soldier who had spent most of his life maintaining mining equipment on frontier worlds. When the war started, he had volunteered for the Colonial Defense Force, not because he loved fighting, but because he had a daughter on Earth who deserved to grow up free. Intelligence reports said he was suffering from at least 3 serious wounds and should have been barely able to stand. Instead, assumption the Corvani had about human behavior. At 0800 hours, when the humans should have been preparing their final surrender, he opened a communication channel to Veralis command post. Commander Veralis, the human's voice crackled through the static. This is Sergeant Major Otehu. We're coming for you. Veralis had initially thought it was some kind of psychological trick. The humans were surrounded, outnumbered 20-1, armed with nothing but improvised weapons and raw determination. The idea that they would launch an attack was so absurd it bordered on insanity. 23 humans emerged from Firebase. Echo at exactly 0815 hours, Veralis recalled, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. They didn't sneak out under cover of darkness or try to slip past our perimeter. They walked out the front gate in broad daylight, formed a skirmish line, and began advancing toward our main position. Dexera stopped taking notes, her stylus frozen above the datapad. That's suicide. That's what we thought, Veralis replied. They had no energy weapons, no powered armor, no vehicle support. Most of them were carrying improvised clubs made from broken antenna arrays and kitchen knives taped to metal pipes. Should have been target practice for our gunners. But the humans didn't advance like soldiers walking to their deaths. Moved with the coordinated precision of a predator pack, each fighter covering the others while maintaining perfect formation discipline. Oteho led from the front, his improvised weapon gleaming in the morning sun as he shouted orders that kept his tiny force moving like a single organism. The first surprise came when Private Kim Na-young somehow got close enough to the Corvani defensive line to deploy her homemade weapons. The 24-year-old communications specialist had spent the siege crafting magnetic mines from spare electronics, metal scrapings, and cleaning chemicals. Devices that should have been harmless toys somehow disabled 3 armored vehicles in the space of 30 seconds. She moved like liquid lightning, Veralis said, sliding under our hover tanks, attaching her devices to critical systems, and rolling away before our gunners could track her. Those improvised mines shouldn't have been able to penetrate military-grade armor, but she had somehow figured out exactly where to place them for maximum damage. Lance Corporal Song Jamin represented the kind of creative problem-solving that made humans so terrifying to fight. He had found a broken Corvani plasma rifle in the wreckage of an earlier battle and somehow jury-rigged it into a close range weapon that could punch through the Empire's best armor. The weapon only worked at point-blank range and would probably explode after a few shots, but in the hands of a desperate human, it became deadlier than anything in the Corvani arsenal. He charged straight into our defensive positions, Veralis recalled, not running away from danger, but toward it. Using that improvised weapon like a precision instrument, targeting weak points in our armor that our own engineers didn't know existed. But it wasn't just individual acts of heroism that broke the Corvani line. The humans fought with a coordination that seemed impossible for such a small force. When Oteho felt a plasma fire, Private Lee Kyung-min immediately took command, picking up the sergeant major's weapon and continuing the assault without missing a beat. When she was wounded by shrapnel, Corporal Jung De-haeon stepped into the leadership role as if the transition had been rehearsed for months. They had no formal chain of command structure, Veralis explained. No complex military protocols or communication systems. But somehow, they all knew exactly what needed to be done and who should do it. It was like watching a single mind operating through multiple bodies. The psychological impact on the Corvani forces was catastrophic. Soldiers who had never retreated from any enemy began falling back from positions they should have been able to hold against 10 times as many attackers. Elite warriors started hesitating at critical moments, second-guessing orders, and making tactical mistakes that cost lives and equipment. We began to realize that we weren't fighting soldiers in any sense. We understood, Veralis admitted. We're fighting something that treated impossible odds as a personal challenge. Every setback made them more determined, not less. Every casualty made the survivors fight harder instead of breaking their morale. The human counterattack lasted only 18 minutes, But in that brief span, 23 lightly armed humans had routed a force of over 1,000 Corvani warriors. Not through superior technology or numbers, but through sheer refusal to accept that defeat was possible. They fought like the laws of physics were suggestions rather than absolute rules. Private Park Minjan was shot 4 times, Vralith continued. Any one of those wounds should have been fatal to a human. Instead, he used his own blood to mark targets for the other fighters, then continued advancing until he physically couldn't move anymore. Even then, he kept providing covering fire from whatever position he fell in. The breaking point came when the surviving humans actually reached the Corvani command bunker. Corporal Jung Dahayan, bleeding from multiple wounds and armed with nothing but a broken piece of metal, somehow breached the armored entrance and began engaging Corvani officers in hand-to-hand combat. She killed 3 trained warriors before finally being overwhelmed, but not before planting an improvised explosive that would have destroyed the entire command structure. She could have surrendered, Vralith said. We would have treated her. Wounds held her as a prisoner of war according to galactic conventions. Instead, she chose to die fighting and nearly took our entire command staff with her. The human counterattack was finally stopped not by superior Corvani tactics, but by simple mathematics. 23 humans, no matter how determined, could only fight so long against such overwhelming odds. But in those 18 minutes, they had accomplished something that would haunt the Empire for generations. They proved that victory and defeat weren't the same thing, Vralith whispered. We killed them all, secured Firebase Echo, and technically won the battle. But every Corvani soldier who survived that counterattack knew. We had been defeated by something far more dangerous than any weapon. We had been defeated by the human refusal to accept that they could be defeated. The psychological scars from that brief, impossible battle would spread through the entire 3rd Assault Legion like a virus. Elite warriors who had conquered dozens of worlds began requesting transfers away from human space. Others simply refused orders that might bring them into contact with human forces. The Empire's most effective military unit was effectively destroyed not by enemy action, but by the growing realization that they were fighting something that couldn't be understood, predicted, or defeated through conventional means. We weren't just fighting soldiers, Vralith concluded. We were fighting a species that treated impossible odds as a personal insult. Dexera set down her stylus with trembling fingers, her blue skin pale as moonlight. The recording device hummed quietly between them, capturing every word of the most disturbing military debriefing in Empire history. She had expected a standard after-action report about tactical mistakes and equipment failures. Instead, she was listening to the psychological autopsy of an entire military campaign. You're telling me that 150 humans defeated 2,000 of our elite troops? She asked, her voice barely steady. Verles's compound eyes fixed on her with an intensity that made her want to look away. No, investigator, they didn't defeat us. They broke us. There's a difference between losing a battle and having your entire understanding of warfare shattered by an enemy that refuses to follow the rules. The massive warrior shifted in his chair, the metal groaning under his weight. When Firebase Echo finally fell, we thought we had one. The humans were dead, their weapons destroyed, their positions secured. We had accomplished our tactical objectives and could report success to High Command. But victory felt like defeat, and we couldn't understand why. Firebase Echo had been reduced to rubble and smoking craters. The human defenders lay scattered across the defensive positions, their improvised weapons broken and useless beside their bodies. It should have been the end of the story, another footnote in the Empire's long history of conquest. Instead, it became the beginning of something that would haunt Vralith for the rest of his life. We found their final bunker buried beneath the main communication tower, he continued. A reinforced shelter that had somehow survived 3 days of bombardment. Our engineers said it would take hours to cut through the armored door, but we had time. The battle was over, the humans were dead, and we wanted to see what they had been protecting so desperately. The bunker had been designed as a last resort command center, equipped with long-range communication equipment and enough supplies to sustain a small garrison for weeks. When the Corvani finally breached the entrance, they expected to find abandoned, equipment, and maybe a few personal belongings left behind by the dead defenders. Instead, they found Private Kong Min-sik. 19 years old, Vrelith said quietly, fresh out of basic training assigned to Firebase Echo as a communications specialist. He'd been wounded in 3 places during the final assault. Plasma burns on his left arm and leg. Shrapnel in his chest that should have killed him hours earlier. Any rational being would have used the bunker as a hiding place, hoping to survive until the shooting stopped. But Kong Min-sik wasn't hiding. When the Corvani soldiers burst through the bunker door, they found him at the communication console, his bloodied fingers still working the controls. The young human looked up at the armored aliens with eyes that held no fear, no desperation, no plea for mercy. Just cold determination and something that might have been pity. He was still transmitting, Vralith whispered. Not a distress call or a surrender message. He was sending tactical data to other human units across the sector. Information about our weapons, our tactics, our weaknesses. Everything his people had learned during the siege packaged and transmitted so that other humans could use it in future battles. The transmission logs were staggering in their scope and detail. Kang had somehow documented every phase of the siege, analyzing Corvani tactics and identifying countermeasures that future human defenders could employ. Weaknesses in their armor that could be exploited with improvised weapons. Patterns in their attack formations that could be predicted and countered. Even psychological profiles of individual Corvani officers, complete with suggestions for exploiting their personal fears and hesitations. He had turned the entire siege into a learning experience, Vralith explained. Every human who died bought time for him to gather more intelligence. Every failed attack provided data about our capabilities. The defense of Firebase Echo wasn't just about holding territory, it was about ensuring that future human defenders would be better prepared. Dexara's membrane-thin ears were flat against her skull, a sign of deep distress. But he was dying. Surely survival instinct would have? That's what we didn't understand, Vralith interrupted. For humans, survival isn't just biological, it's ideological. They don't just fight to preserve their individual lives, they fight to ensure their species' knowledge and experience survives. Kang wasn't trying to save himself. He was trying to save every human who would face the Empire in future battles. The young human had continued transmitting, even as Corvani soldiers surrounded him. His final message, recorded by their own equipment, would become legendary among the human resistance. Not because it was dramatic or inspiring, but because it was so coldly practical. Firebase Echo defensive analysis complete, Kong had said into his communicator. Corvani plasma weapons vulnerable to electromagnetic interference. Recommend copper mesh shielding for critical equipment. Armor weak points identified at joint connections. Suggest targeting with high-velocity projectiles. Psychological profile. Indicates commanders become indecisive when faced with unexpected tactics. Recommend continuous adaptation of strategies to maintain enemy confusion. The transmission had continued for nearly 10 minutes. With Kang methodically documenting every lesson learned during the siege, when Corvani soldiers finally moved to stop him, he had looked up with those cold, determined eyes and spoken his final words. Tell your commanders that humans learn from every battle. What worked today won't work tomorrow. What worked yesterday definitely won't work tomorrow. We get better. You stay the same. Then he had triggered an explosive device that destroyed the communication equipment, ensuring that the Corvani couldn't trace the transmissions or intercept future human communications. His death was as calculated and purposeful as his life had been during those final hours. That's when I understood what we were really fighting, Vralith said, his voice barely audible. This wasn't about territory or resources or even survival. In the traditional sense, for humans, every battle is a teaching moment. Every defeat is a lesson that makes them stronger. Every casualty is a sacrifice that improves their chances in the next engagement. The psychological impact of discovering Kong's final mission had rippled through the entire Corvani force. Soldiers who thought they had won a victory realized they had instead participated in a human learning exercise. Every tactic they had, used every weakness they had revealed. Every mistake they had made was now part of the human military database. The Empire's high command made the decision within days, Vralith continued. Not to escalate the war, not to commit more forces, but to seek peace negotiations. Not because we couldn't defeat the humans militarily. We have the ships, weapons, the technology to glass every human world. But because we finally understood what we were fighting. He stood slowly, his massive frame casting shadows across the interrogation room. Every human we kill makes the others stronger. Every battle we win teaches them how to win the next one. Every piece of our technology they capture becomes a weapon they can use against us. They're not just a species investigator. They're a force of nature that learns and adapts and grows stronger with every challenge. Daxara reached for the recording device with shaking hands. Finally understanding why this debriefing had been classified at the highest levels. Corvani Empire hadn't just encountered a new enemy. They had discovered something that challenged their entire understanding of warfare and conquest. One more thing, Vralith said, as she prepared to end the recording. The humans have a saying that one of their prisoners shared with me. The only easy day was yesterday. I thought it was just military bravado at first, but now I understand what it means. His 6 eyes reflected the harsh fluorescent lights as he delivered his final assessment. Every day they become harder to defeat. Every day they become more dangerous. Every day they become more human. And that, investigator, is the most terrifying enemy the galaxy has ever seen. The recording device clicked off, leaving the room in silence. Somewhere in the darkness between stars, humanity was learning, adapting, and preparing for whatever challenges the universe might throw at them. The Corvani Empire had learned to fear many things during their rise to galactic dominance. But they had never learned to fear the simple, inexorable power of a species that refused to stop growing. Stronger, the war was over. The real challenge was just beginning. The end.